Farm Basics is brought to you by the Liberty Link trait and Liberty herbicide from Bayer. The most reliable weed management solution, Liberty Link and Liberty herbicide are the link to efficient row crop production and sustainable weed management.
During our Farm Basics time today, we wanted to discuss the purpose of shelter belts or tree belts on the farm.
Well, I'm certainly feeling one of those purposes today, Brian. It's kind of a windy day. We've got a nice shelter belt along the side of us, and it's not windy out here where we're filming.
Well, honestly, just so you know, this is one of the big things when we do film Ag PhD. We're not spending millions of dollars on some elaborate production set. We try to go near shelter belts if it's windy, so we have wind protection. We just can't have lots of wind when we're filming the show.
That's called old school, Brian. We just go old school. Well, for farmers, they like to have tree belts around their farm places to try and stop winds, especially the winds in the winter. They can get bitterly cold in the upper Midwest. So you'll see a lot of farmers with tree belts on the north side of their farms and on the west sides of their farms. That way it holds that northwest wind back. It's going to be blowing in all winter long, and it allows that sunshine to get in from the south and the east.
Well, it also will hold back the snow. When the snow does come, that will build up in the shelter belt, and then you get your snow banks right around the shelter belt rather than right in your driveway.
Well, one of the things that we saw, Brian, on some of our travels around the world in Ukraine a few years back, we noticed all these tree belts around, most every field had a tree belt around it. And that was their solution to fighting the weather in the dirty 30s. They didn't want to see that erosion problem again. And so the government just ordered that everyone plant trees around their fields. So that's what they did.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed too over the years, a lot of farmers will complain about having shelter belts right near their field because sometimes the trees fall down, like there's a tree just about right in front of us that fell down, and obviously then it has to get cleaned up. Or also you'll get branches sometimes that will hang out over. I know even in our operation, we wrecked an auger on a combine one time because the tree was hanging out over the field. Our guy wasn't paying attention and probably did $5,000 worth of damage. So those things happen. But the positive of having that shelter belt there is not just the fact that you don't have as much wind erosion, but in a windy area of the country like where we're at in South Dakota, there's wind blowing every day. Next to the shelter belt where there's not so much wind, the plants actually get a little taller and sometimes yield a little more.
Well, the other thing right along those tree belts, you'll see the cattle will hang out if they're out grazing the stalks, or if there's a pasture right alongside the tree belt. They get a little bit of shade out of that hot summer sun. They get a little protection out of the wind. There are many positives about having tree belts out around your farm or around your fields.
Yeah, but another one of the negative things is just the fact that as tall as a tree is, you can figure it's going to have roots out at least that far. So let's say you had a really tall shelter belt next to your field. Let's say that some of those trees were 60 feet tall. Okay, well that means those roots are going to be 60 feet out. And if your crop is within 30 feet, let's call it, of your shelter belt, well now you know you're going to have roots from the trees going into your crop field 30 feet. That could pull moisture away, and in a dry year, that could be a very bad thing.
Well, there certainly are some drawbacks to any good thing. There's nothing that's just, or there's very few things, I should say, that are all good. Otherwise, everybody would say, well, wow, we all have to have that. Tree belts have their pros and have their cons, but for the most part, we really like having tree belts, especially around farm places. It gives you that protection from snow, from wind, those kind of things, from weather conditions. But we also like them on the edges of fields. It's not a bad thing to slow that wind down a little bit and help prevent erosion.
All right, let's just have a couple quick tips, Darren, on if you were going to start a brand new shelter belt, what would you do? A lot of people in our area, for example, will call the NRCS, the government office, and they'll actually come out and plant trees for you for a pretty reasonable fee. But beyond that, what are you going to do to establish these trees?
Well, one of the things that we like to do before we plant trees is we like to put down a rate of a herbicide. For most tree species, Treflan has been fairly safe. If you're using some Treflan, let's just say you're planting around the edge of a soybean field. If you had Treflan where you're going to plant the trees, our experience has been the trees haven't died. Now, that may or may not be labeled, so you have to check that out. We don't want you to do anything that's off label, but we have done some Treflan in between tree rows. That's been a real safe product for us. We like to put a row of bushes or something fast growing around the outside row of the tree belt. That way it gives some protection to the small trees on the inside row. The other thing to plan for is leave plenty of space between the trees. So find out how much they're going to spread out. Leave that much space. And I know it looks when you're planting little trees, oh wow, I don't really need to leave 30 feet in between trees. But with some species, you may need to leave even more than 30 feet, so when they grow up, they can reach their full potential.
The first few years of establishing a tree belt are obviously the most difficult, and they're the most important. So you want to make sure you're keeping weeds out of there. You can go spray Roundup in your tree belts too, as long as you keep the Roundup off the trees. And then besides that, water them. I know Darren and I used to haul around lots of water when we were getting tree belts established. You got to water those things on a very regular basis.
Well, a year like this year was pretty tough to establish a new tree belt. And again, it's a good time where you could say, wow, I'm sure glad I had that tree belt around the place to give us a little shade and a little protection from that hot summer sun.
Well, one of the things you may have needed protection from on your farm was our weed of the week. Can you identify this week's weed?